There is a military concept that most people have never heard of. It is more devastating than any missile, more decisive than any airstrike, and more permanent in its consequences than any battle fought on open ground. It is called a logistical siege. No troops crossing a border. No naval mines seated in a shipping lane. No ground forces fighting block by block through a defended city. Just the systematic, precise, irreversible elimination of every road, every bridge, every railway corridor, and every supply line through which a military force feeds itself, arms itself, fuels itself, and sustains its ability to keep fighting. You do not defeat the army. You starve it. You cut every artery. You sever every vein. And then you wait for the military machine to consume its own reserves until there is nothing left to consume and the fighting stops. Not because the adversary chose to stop, but because the adversary physically cannot continue. That is what happened on Night 6 of the American campaign against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in southern Iran. And understanding why Night 6 is categorically different from everything that preceded it, why the bridge strikes represent a strategic threshold rather than simply another set of targets checked off a list, requires understanding what those bridges connected, what they fed, and what the IRGC's southern military apparatus looks like right now that they are gone. But let's back all the way up, because Nights 1 through 5 built something that Night 6 then used. And you cannot understand the siege without understanding the platform the campaign constructed to enable it. The first 5 nights of American strikes ran the standard suppression and strike sequence that has characterized every phase of this campaign. Coastal radars eliminated to blind the air defense network, missile batteries struck to reduce the active threat inventory, fast attack boats destroyed to degrade the maritime harassment capability that has been threatening commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Command centers in Tehran struck to decapitate the operational coordination architecture. All of that was necessary. All of that was clearing the path. All of it was preparation for what Night 6 required. The freedom to operate in the logistics network of Iran's southern military theater without the air defense coverage, the early warning infrastructure, and the command coordination that would otherwise complicate the access. Night 6 was the moment the campaign transitioned from degradation to siege, from hitting what Iran fights with to cutting off the supply system that allows Iran to keep fighting at all. 6 highway and railway bridges in Hormuzgan province struck and destroyed in a single operational window. The Guria Bridge on the Bandar Abbas to Kamir to Larak route, gone. 2 bridges on the Kuristan Road, gone. Bridges near Latadan, Keshar, and Maru village, gone. The Chabahar port control tower struck for the 3rd time in this conflict, this time completely destroyed. And the USS Abraham Lincoln's carrier strike group successfully intercepted 111 Iranian ballistic missiles in the same period, every single one defeated before impact. Read those 2 data points together with the analytical weight they deserve. 111 missiles launched at a carrier strike group, 0 penetrations, and 6 bridges in southern Iran deleted from the operational map in the same night. That combination describes a military balance that has reached a point of asymmetry so pronounced that the IRGC's own public statements cannot paper over what its operational behavior is revealing. Bandar Abbas is the reason the bridges matter more than any other category of target the campaign has addressed. Most coverage of this conflict treats Bandar Abbas as one port city among several in Iran's Persian Gulf coastline, with military significance primarily as the home of the IRGC Navy's main fleet. That framing understates its importance by an order of magnitude. Bandar Abbas is not simply a port. It is the central logistics hub of everything the IRGC does in the southern theater. Every missile that has been positioned along the Iranian coastline to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz had to travel a road to get there. Every drone loaded onto a truck and driven to a coastal launch position moved through the transportation network connecting Bandar Abbas to the Iranian interior. Every barrel of fuel keeping IRGC patrol boats operational came through the supply chain that terminates at Bandar Abbas. Every replacement component for a radar system, every round of ammunition for a fast attack boat crew, every logistics input that sustains military operations along the southern coast, all of it flows through the highway and railway corridors connecting Bandar Abbas northward to central Iran and ultimately to Tehran. Bandar Abbas is not just a port. It is the pipeline end of the IRGC's entire southern logistics system. The bridges that carry that pipeline across the riverbeds and ravines of Hormuzgan province are the valves through which everything flows. Cut those valves, and you do not merely inconvenience the supply chain, you eliminate it. A missile battery that cannot be resupplied with replacement missiles is not a missile battery. It is a one-use installation that becomes operationally irrelevant the moment its initial inventory is expended. A fast attack boat crew that cannot receive fuel resupply is stranded at whatever dock it can reach until the fuel runs out. A radar installation that cannot receive replacement components when American precision munitions damage its systems is a static target waiting for the next strike cycle to finish what the previous one started. The IRGC spent years and enormous financial resources building the military infrastructure along Iran's southern coast. The weapons, the launch sites, the storage facilities, the command nodes, the patrol boat fleet. What it did not fully harden against the specific scenario. Now unfolding is the road network that connects all of those military assets to the supply system that keeps them operational. That road network no longer exists in Hormuzgan province in the form it existed 48 hours ago. The specific geography of each destroyed bridge reveals the operational coherence of the targeting. The Guria Bridge sits on the Bandar Abbas to Khmer to Larak route, the primary coastal road connecting Bandar Abbas northward along the Gulf Coast to the junction points where inland routes branch toward the Iranian interior. This is not a secondary road. This is the main arterial connection between Bandar Abbas and the next set of logistics nodes up the coast. Destroying the Guria Bridge does not merely block one route. It forces any vehicle attempting to move supplies from the interior to the coast to find an alternative that may not exist at the necessary capacity, that may not be able to handle the weight of military equipment and fuel tankers, and that may itself be in the targeting database for the next strike cycle. The two bridges on the Kharg Road represent redundancy elimination, the deliberate targeting of the backup routes that IRGC logistics planners would have identified as alternatives when the primary route was compromised. The lesson of nights 1 through 5 is that the American target list is generated from the same intelligence database that the IRGC uses to understand its own infrastructure. When American planners decide to cut the supply lines to Bandar Abbas, they do not merely destroy the most obvious bridge. They destroy the obvious bridge, the backup bridge, and the tertiary routes simultaneously in the same operational window, before the IRGC can redirect its supply flow to the alternative paths it would otherwise identify. The IRGC's logistics officers found on the morning after Night 6 that their primary route was gone, their backup routes were gone, and the planning time needed to develop new routes is time that does not exist while operational consumption of supplies continues in real time. The bridges near Latadan, Kesher, and Maru village complete the cordon. These are the connective tissue, the smaller crossings and route segments that provide the routing flexibility, allowing a logistics network to adapt when its primary arteries are disrupted. By striking them in the same operational window as the larger bridges on the primary routes, the campaign has not merely cut a road. It has eliminated the entire routing flexibility of the logistics network simultaneously, leaving IRGC forces in the south with whatever supplies are physically present at forward positions and no reliable way to replenish them. The Chabahar dimension adds the southeastern closure that completes the siege geometry. Chabahar has been Iran's alternative maritime gateway, positioned on the Gulf of Oman outside the Strait of Hormuz, theoretically providing a logistics route that bypasses the strait's contested navigability and provides a channel for supply that cannot be interdicted through strait operations. 3 strikes across this conflict against the port control tower, and now its complete destruction removes that alternative. The supply chain redundancy Chabahar was designed to provide has been eliminated in the same night that the overland redundancy in Hormuzgan was eliminated. The IRGC's southern military apparatus has been sealed from its supply chain from 2 directions simultaneously, overland from the north through the destroyed bridge network, and maritime from the southeast through the destroyed port control infrastructure. Now, to what 111 intercepted Iranian ballistic missiles tells you about the conflict's military balance, because this number carries analytical weight that exceeds its immediate tactical significance. The USS Abraham Lincoln's carrier strike group and its associated defensive architecture, the Aegis-equipped destroyers, the Standard Missile Interceptors, the layered point defense systems, the airborne early warning coverage from the E-2 Hawkeyes, successfully intercepted 111 Iranian ballistic missiles in a single engagement period. Every single one. 0 penetrations. This is the Iron Dome effect at the scale of a carrier strike group operating as a unified defensive system, and it tells you several things simultaneously about the current state of the military balance. First, Iran is still launching 111 missiles in a single engagement period. That means the IRGC's surviving missile forces are not conserving inventory. They are expending it at a rate that reflects either the operational urgency of the military situation or the institutional imperative to be seen responding. Either motivation produces the same outcome, a missile inventory being consumed faster than it can be replaced against a defensive architecture that is defeating the entire salvo and producing 0 military effect on the carrier strike group at enormous cost to the IRGC's remaining offensive capability. Second, the intercept rate has reached a level of near perfection that changes the IRGC's operational calculus in ways that go beyond the immediate military exchange. Earlier in this conflict, isolated Iranian ballistic missiles achieved direct impacts on American bases in Jordan. Air defense coverage in that earlier exchange was imperfect. Interceptors missed, warheads landed, damage was confirmed. What has happened against the Abraham Lincoln strike group is categorically different. A 100% intercept rate is not a 10% improvement over a 90% intercept rate. It is the difference between an adversary that can occasionally achieve military effect through volume of fire and an adversary that cannot achieve any military effect regardless of how many missiles it launches against this specific defensive configuration. Third, the daily Iranian missile firing rate tells you directly about the depletion of accessible inventory. Reports now indicate the IRGC can fire approximately a dozen missiles per day compared to the multi-dozen coordinated salvos documented in the opening exchanges of this conflict. The decline from large coordinated salvos to approximately 12 missiles per day is not a strategic conservation decision. It is the operational signature of a force running out of what it can readily access, a force whose storage facilities have been struck, whose production infrastructure has been damaged, whose resupply routes have been cut, and whose launch infrastructure has been progressively eliminated by consecutive nights of American air operations. You do not go from launching scores of missiles in coordinated salvos to 12 per day because you have implemented a conservation strategy for a decisive future moment. You go to 12 per day because 12 per day is what you can still access, coordinate, and launch through what remains of your operational infrastructure. The naval blockade enforcement adds the economic dimension of the siege that operates in parallel with the logistical dimension of the bridge strikes. The MT Bellatrix, a Curacao-flagged, very large crude carrier that had transported approximately 38 million barrels of Iranian crude over its operational lifetime, ignored multiple warnings from the U.S. Navy and continued its approach toward Kharg Island. An American aircraft fired AGM-114 Hellfire missiles directly into the vessel's smokestack, disabling its propulsion without sinking the ship or targeting the crew. The vessel was stopped. Kharg Island did not receive its cargo. The precision of that engagement, a Hellfire missile into a smokestack, disabling propulsion without crew casualties or environmental catastrophe, is a specific operational choice that communicates something beyond the simple enforcement of the blockade. The American side chose the minimum force necessary to stop the vessel without producing the kind of humanitarian incident that would complicate the international perception of the blockade's legitimacy. A missile that disables propulsion and stops the ship is a demonstration of both the capability and the intent to enforce the blockade at the most precise available level of force. Every other Shadow Fleet operator who watched the MT Bellatrix stopped in the water received the same message. The blockade is real. The enforcement is precise. The capacity to conduct that enforcement exists in the theater right now, and the willingness to use it has been demonstrated operationally rather than stated diplomatically. The question for any future vessel attempting to run the blockade is not whether American forces will act. The MT Bellatrix answered that question. The question is whether the cargo is worth the demonstrated consequence of ignoring the warnings. Kharg Island is Iran's primary oil export terminal, handling the bulk of Iranian crude production accessible to export markets despite the sanctions regime. A blockade kinetically enforced against any vessel approaching Kharg Island is not a sanctions designation or a diplomatic pressure tool. It is the physical elimination of Iran's remaining oil export revenue at its point of departure. No revenue from Kharg Island means no procurement budget for replacement missiles, no procurement budget for replacement drones, no salary payments to IRGC personnel, no maintenance budget for the equipment that survives the American strikes. The blockade is not an adjunct to the military campaign. It is the financial dimension of the same siege strategy that the bridge strikes represent on the logistics dimension. Cutting off supply on one axis while cutting off revenue on another, the China dimension of this conflict demands specific analytical attention that most coverage treats as a footnote. Chinese firms with documented links to the People's Liberation Army, specifically Mizervision and Jinggang Technology, have been confirmed by the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission as marketing geospatial intelligence on American force positions in the Middle East. China's Beidou navigation satellite system has been confirmed as having been used by Iran to conduct direct attacks across the region. This is not an ambiguous commercial activity that might incidentally benefit Iranian military operations. This is the deliberate provision of targeting data and satellite navigation capability to a force that is launching ballistic missiles at American carrier strike groups and striking American military bases across the Gulf. The Beidou dimension carries particular analytical weight because satellite navigation is not a peripheral capability for modern ballistic missile operations. It is foundational. A ballistic missile without precise navigation guidance is an area weapon, dangerous in a general sense, but incapable of the kind of specific facility and platform targeting that makes ballistic missile forces a coherent military instrument rather than a terror weapon. The Chinese state-linked firms providing geospatial intelligence are giving Iran the targeting picture. The Beidou satellite system is giving Iran the navigation architecture. Together, they are providing the two components that convert Iranian ballistic missiles from relatively imprecise area denial weapons into directed, targeted military instruments aimed at specific American platforms and positions. When the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission confirms this, and when those contributions are directly enabling attacks on American carrier strike groups, the conflict is no longer purely a bilateral Iran-U.S. confrontation. It is a proxy confrontation in which China is providing the targeting infrastructure that Iran uses to fight, while maintaining the public posture of a neutral party urging diplomatic de-escalation. China saying one thing through diplomatic channels and doing the opposite through its defense industry and satellite navigation architecture is the structural definition of the most significant intelligence relationship in the current conflict, and one that the operational and strategic calculations of the American campaign must account for in ways that extend beyond anything visible in the daily strike reporting. The immediate operational implication is that the intelligence picture Iran is receiving about American force dispositions has external augmentation beyond its own organic ISR capability. American forces are operating with the knowledge that their positions are being observed not just by Iranian surveillance assets, most of which have been destroyed across the campaign's 9 nights, but by satellite and commercial geospatial intelligence networks connected to Chinese entities. That knowledge shapes operational security decisions, movement patterns, and the intelligence countermeasures that American forces apply in ways that are not visible in the public reporting, but that are directly relevant to understanding why certain operational details are scrubbed from CENTCOM's released footage, and why certain force dispositions are managed with a level of security that goes beyond the standard procedures of an unobserved operation. The IRGC's response to the bridge strikes and the blockade enforcement included a threshold crossing that reveals the strategic desperation of its current position more clearly than any official statement could. Iranian forces struck a power and water desalination plant in Kuwait. That target designation requires specific analytical treatment. A desalination plant is not a military facility. It is the infrastructure through which Kuwait produces the fresh water that its population drinks, its industrial facilities operate, and its agricultural production is sustained. Kuwait is a country with virtually no natural fresh water. Its desalination infrastructure is not a strategic luxury. It is an existential requirement. Striking a Kuwaiti desalination plant is not a military escalation in the conventional sense. It is an attempt to impose harm on civilian infrastructure that produces the most fundamental human necessity in a country whose government has permitted American operations from its soil. A military force that is winning, that retains significant offensive capability, that has a realistic path to its stated objectives, does not need to strike an ally country's water supply. It applies military pressure through military means and achieves military outcomes. A force that strikes water plants is a force that has run out of military means capable of producing military outcomes and has shifted to the strategy of imposing civilian pain on countries hosting the adversary, hoping that suffering will generate the political pressure to stop the military campaign. That is the logic of the desperate, not the capable. And the IRGC executing that logic while CENTCOM is simultaneously destroying its bridges, sealing its port control infrastructure, and intercepting its entire missile salvo without a single penetration is the most honest assessment available of what the IRGC's strategic condition actually looks like from the inside. The strategic logic of what the IRGC was actually attempting to achieve through this conflict, and why the bridge strikes represent the demolition of that logic rather than simply another tactical setback, requires understanding what the IRGC's end state actually was. Not the destruction of the American military presence in the Gulf. That was never a realistic objective, and the IRGC's strategic planners are not deluded enough to have believed it achievable. The IRGC's end state was legal and operational control of the Strait of Hormuz as a permanent post-conflict condition, a toll booth on approximately 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply, enforced by the credible threat of IRGC missiles, patrol boats, and coastal defense systems against any vessel that did not comply with whatever transit requirements the Islamic Republic chose to impose. The leverage that control would have provided over every energy importing country on the planet, over the pricing of the commodity that industrial civilization runs on, over the diplomatic and economic relationships of every Gulf state whose exports depend on strait access, would have transformed the IRGC from a regional military power into a structural veto over the global energy economy. The June Memorandum of Understanding that preceded the current phase of the conflict was Iran's attempt to get that control codified in a diplomatic framework, to translate the military leverage of an unresolved confrontation into a written agreement recognizing Iranian authority over the waterway in terms that could be enforced without continuous escalation. The IRGC's decision to break the ceasefire by attacking commercial vessels was not a miscalculation or a tactical error. It was a deliberate test of whether the United States would enforce the terms of the arrangement or look away to preserve the diplomatic framework. The calculus was specific. If America looks away, the toll booth is validated and no diplomatic agreement actually constrains Iran's ability to exercise it. If America responds with military force, the IRGC's military infrastructure would impose sufficient cost to make the continuation of that response politically unsustainable before Iranian military capability was exhausted. The calculus was wrong on every dimension simultaneously. Wrong about American political will, wrong about the cost the IRGC's military infrastructure could impose on American operations, wrong about the timeline over which IRGC military capability would degrade under American air power, and wrong most fundamentally about the gap between what the IRGC had built on the surface and what it had hardened underground, because surface infrastructure, radar sites, missile batteries, fast attack boats, command centers, bridges, port control towers, has proven to be the operational dependency that underground assets cannot function without. You can hide missiles in an underground missile city, but you cannot launch them from underground without the above-ground launch infrastructure that has been struck. You can hide generals in bunkers, but you cannot coordinate military operations when the communication nodes connecting the bunker to the operational elements have been eliminated. You can survive American strikes underground, but you cannot fight from underground when the supply routes that bring fuel and ammunition to your above-ground forces no longer exist, because the bridges carrying them were destroyed on Night 6. The underground assets that Iran invested decades in building are still there, but they are operational assets that have been separated from the above-ground infrastructure they depend on to function. A missile in an underground tunnel is not a military threat until it can be moved to a launch position, fueled and targeted, all of which requires the above-ground infrastructure that is now either destroyed or cut off from its own supply chain. The miscalculation at the foundation of the IRGC's strategy was the assumption that the American military's willingness to respond was the variable most likely to be exhausted before Iranian military capability was. That assumption has been tested against the operational reality of 9 consecutive nights of strikes that have not paused, have not been deterred, and have not produced a single operational pause in the American campaign, despite 111 Iranian ballistic missiles directed at the carrier strike group at the center of the force executing it. The American campaign is not pausing to assess whether Iran will negotiate. It is continuing at the tempo and scope that the available targeting list requires, and that tempo is not being shaped by Iranian military responses that have achieved 0 penetrations against the carrier defensive architecture. The 50,000 American troops that CENTCOM cited in its bridge strike confirmation are not a throwaway number in a press release. They are a deliberate signal to every audience simultaneously, to Iranian leadership calculating whether to accept a deal or continue fighting, to Gulf state partners who need to understand the American commitment is durable, and to any third-party actors considering whether the window for intervening in this conflict on Iran's behalf is still open. 50,000 troops described as vigilant, lethal, and ready is not the language of a force winding down toward a diplomatic phase. It is the language of a force prepared for whatever comes next in a conflict whose trajectory is still being determined by the American campaign's operational momentum. The honest strategic assessment requires acknowledging what 9 days of consecutive strikes, 6 bridges destroyed in a single night, 111 missiles intercepted without a single penetration, a blockade kinetically enforced with Hellfire missiles against a supertanker approaching Kharg Island, command centers in Tehran struck, and an IRGC daily missile rate declining to approximately 12 rounds per day actually means about the trajectory of this conflict. The IRGC is losing its ability to sustain organized military operations faster than any external timeline predicted. Its supply chain to the south has been severed. Its missile inventory is depleting without effective replacement. Its command infrastructure has been struck. Its air defense network across the southern coast has been eliminated. Its fast attack fleet has been reduced to whatever survives in hiding. Its revenue from oil exports has been blocked at Kharg Island. Its alternative maritime gateway at Chabahar has been closed by the destruction of its port control infrastructure. And the bridges that connected all of the above to the logistical system that sustained them have been removed from the map. What remains of the IRGC's operational capability in the south is whatever was prepositioned forward before the bridges were destroyed. Missiles already at launch sites, fuel already in storage tanks at coastal positions, ammunition already distributed to forward units. When those prepositioned reserves run out, and they are running out against the background of 12 missiles per day and 0 replacements arriving through the severed supply chain, the IRGC's southern military apparatus will be unable to sustain operations, not because of any single decisive strike, but because the logistical siege has consumed its operational reserves. The toll booth that the IRGC wanted on the Strait of Hormuz depended on a military infrastructure that is being systematically dismantled from the outside in. Surface systems first, then logistics, then command, then revenue. Night 6 targeted the bridges. The targeting database for the next night was already built before the bridge strikes were complete. And whatever that database contains, it will execute against an Iranian military architecture that has one fewer logistics network, one fewer command center, one fewer supply route, and approximately 12 fewer missiles in its accessible inventory than it had when Night 6 began. You starve it. You cut every artery. You sever every vein. And then you wait for the military machine to consume its own reserves. The bridges are gone. The supply chain is cut. The reserves are depleting. And the IRGC cannot fight a war on what is already forward positioned south of the bridges that no longer exist.